We answer Reload members' questions on the legal, political, and cultural aspects of guns in America on this week's episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast.
No, the devil's got no hold on me.
All right, ladies and gentlemen, welcome to another episode of the Weekly Reload Podcast. I'm your host, Stephen Gutowski. I'm also the founder of thereload.com, where you can head over and pick up a membership today if you want to support our reporting, or you can sign up for our free newsletter where you'll be kept up to date on all the latest gun news in America with really just one email a week. We don't crowd your inbox. We try to keep things nice and smooth for you, and we don't send you a million emails. That's for sure. That's part of our commitment here. But this week we are answering members' questions. Those people who buy those memberships are the ones who get to ask us about what's going on, and we're going to try to address a number of their different questions. So with me, I have contributing writer Jake Fogelman. How you doing, Jake?
I'm doing pretty good, Steve. I'm excited to do a Q&A. It's been a little while since we've got to interact with our members and hear what's on their mind and try to answer some of their questions. So I'm looking forward to it. Yeah,
same here. You know, I think our members are really knowledgeable. Hopefully because they're reading our reporting a lot, or maybe hopefully that's reflective of the quality of our reporting. But they're very intelligent folks, and they always have really good questions. So I don't think this episode is any different in that regard. So why don't you start us off with the first one? I think we got to start off easy, start off with some simple stuff that often gets glossed over, right?
Yeah, no, I think it is a shrewd question here. We got from Frank Phillips asking sort of about what the legalese means, putting it into layman's terms. So for example, he wants to know, what's a stay, what's an injunction when we're talking about these gun cases, and how do we know when a gun issue is over and decided other than the Supreme Court. So if you want to take a stab at some of these legalese terms.
Yeah, and that's a good question because it's important. And I try to keep this in mind whenever we're writing about this stuff. You try to frame this in a way that makes sense to people, because I think you get a lot of news out there of, a stay or like an injunction comes down and people assume that the law is blocked and doesn't, the case is over or something like that. And that's not always true, right? In fact, usually it's not true, at least not in the practical, immediate sense, right? And so what you'll get are oftentimes two different rulings that have the effect of blocking a law, right? One is a temporary restraining order, right? Which is, that's something that gets issued quickly. That's something that plaintiffs request for that first. If there's a law that's about to go into effect and they think it harms their constitutional rights, they can ask for a temporary restraining order. And if the judge agrees with them, he'll issue one, and effectively that will stop the law from going into effect, right? Before it has actually begun, basically. And preliminary injunction, on the other hand, is it's very, they're similar, to be honest with you. They're similar ideas, but the preliminary injunction is a little bit more down the line in a court case generally. You essentially get one of those after you've argued the case and the judge has decided it. So it has a little bit more finality to it than a TRO. However, both of these can come with what's called a stay. Usually they do. If the party that loses, especially the government in most cases, the government is requesting an appeal and a stay when they've lost a case at a certain level of the court system, like the very first level, these district courts in the federal system, they'll usually ask for a stay, and they'll ask for an appeal, a stay pending appeal, right? And so, and oftentimes you'll get rulings where they just automatically put a stay on it for a certain number of days pending, to give the government time to appeal the decision. And so a stay basically negates the ruling. And so effectively it keeps things as they were. And that's usually what courts are going for, is to try and maintain the status quo while the lawsuit plays out. So if the law is already in effect, they're most likely going to leave it in effect until the final ruling in a case, until one side effectively gives up or the Supreme Court rules on the issue ultimately, or denies cert or whatever. And so, if the law isn't in effect yet and plaintiffs have convinced the judge that they'd be harmed by it, then the judge is going to try to preserve that status quo of the law not going into effect while this case plays out. So hopefully that gives some basic insight into what these things mean, and how they come to an end. Ultimately, yes, it's either one side gives up or, honest, and especially in the federal court and even state courts, because if you get to the state Supreme Court and lose there, if federal law is implicated in some way, if the Constitution is implicated, for instance, the Bill of Rights, you can also take that ruling to the Supreme Court of the United States. So ultimately, a lot of these things, in theory, if everyone keeps fighting, they would end when the Supreme Court either denies cert, says we're not going to consider this case at all, or it grants cert, and then it takes on the case. And the ultimate outcome of that obviously can't be appealed any further. Did I get that right?
Yeah.
What do you think, Jake?
Yeah, no, I think you nailed it. I think hopefully that's clarifying for Frank. And like you said, it's good to always be reminded that sometimes people don't know what these arcane legal terms mean when we're talking about big gun rulings. So yeah, it's a good question. Good question.
And it could be very confusing too, because especially like a TRO, right? It's not a ruling on the merits. A lot of times these aren't rulings on the merits after the case has been heard and argued. But at the same time, if you get a TRO, it's because the judge thinks that you're going to win on the merits.
Right.
Right. A temporary restraining order, that means that the judge is very confident that you will win on the merits part. And so it's, in practice, they're kind of the same thing. Right.
Right. But we'll see the next question here. We got a series of questions actually for a lot of our members are very interested in what's going on with various pending court cases. So this first one here from David, he wants to know what's taking so long with the Bianchi case out of Maryland, which is the assault weapon ban case that the Supreme Court granted, vacated, and remanded after it decided the Bruen case last June, sent it back to the Fourth Circuit and said, reconsider this case under the new Bruen test, and we still haven't had a decision. So he wants to know, what the heck's taken so long? And he also asks about, various other cases around the country because it's sort of a similar situation there. So do we have any special insight on what's taking the court so long?
Yeah, do you?
Yeah, I was going to say it's. I don't really have a line to the minds of these judges. Unfortunately, that's just sort of the way it is, especially in the federal court system. It's also worth keeping in mind that it's only been a year, right? And in legal terms, a year is not that long for legal cases. For most people that are on the edge of their seat, wanting to hear the conclusion of these cases, that can feel like an eternity. But in the grand scheme of things, that's not uncommon in the legal system. So it's just kind of one of those things where you have to wait and see, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, it's very similar to the Supreme Court itself, where you can try and read tea leaves, but oftentimes it's a black box what goes on inside of there. So why they take the cases they take, or why they do it in the order that they do it, and why it takes so long for some of these lower courts to issue rulings. You could think, well, maybe it's some sort of strategic thing. Maybe maybe the Second Circuit, I believe that is, or the Fourth Circuit, sorry, in the Maryland case, where they don't want to be the ones to issue the ruling because they think their ruling is not likely to survive at the Supreme Court, and they're not willing to, adjust their thinking, or maybe they want to see what it could be similar to what's going on with the Supreme Court itself with these GVRs granting, vacating, and remanding certain cases. I think they do that because they want to see how the lower courts handle these things, what arguments come up, and what opinions get drawn. And so maybe part of the waiting for a number of these cases, there's a number that are, where you've waited months since arguments have been held and there's still no decision. They might be trying to suss out how the courts are coalescing on these different cases. That could be part of it. I mean, hopefully that's not it, but that's, wouldn't be outside the realm of possibility that there's this sort of strategic litigating going on with how these decisions are made. I mean, you can see that, in my opinion, in the Illinois Supreme Court case about their assault weapons ban, where the court, you could blame this on the way that the plaintiffs argued the case, but the court sidestepped the Second Amendment issue altogether. And, by doing that, they kind of reset the clock on any potential Second Amendment challenge, at least in the state courts, to their assault weapons ban. And I think one, at least side benefit of doing that is they don't risk the chance of having that case go to the Supreme Court and being overturned. Because I think a lot of these judges don't want to have a record where they're constantly being overturned. So it could be that. You have Benitez, too, in California, which I believe David asked about him in the same vein. And yeah, I mean, I don't know why he's waiting. Right? Nobody knows. He doesn't tell you, right? But maybe he's waiting to see how the Ninth Circuit, how some of these other courts are handling the Bruen decision and the Bruen standard. His previous rulings had kind of anticipated this history and tradition test that came down in Bruen. That wasn't a brand new creation of the Supreme Court in 2022, right? This was a concept that had been floating around in the lower courts for a while. Kavanaugh was kind of the one who coined it back in the second Heller, DC v. Heller case, where he was in a dissenting opinion. But, Bruen Benitez in California had already used that basic logic or the basic standard to strike down, I think it was the magazine law, their magazine limit. So, it's not like he isn't familiar with the case law or the concept, but yeah, I don't know. I don't know why he's waiting. It's a lot to say. I don't know, I guess. Right.
But this kind of brings.
But we have another question here.
I was going to say the kind of similar. Both David had another question and Paul about two separate cases that might have, be a little bit more satisfying for folks watching this stuff. So Paul asks about the Second Circuit when they might rule on New York's Bruen response carry case, and then David asks about the timeline of the Seventh Circuit. That's the federal case dealing with Illinois' assault weapon ban. And I think what's interesting about those two is that the Supreme Court has already kind of established that they're watching those cases, because in both cases there was an attempt to get emergency or early intervention from the Supreme Court. And so in both cases, they were put on expedited review is what they call it. And, people shouldn't get over their skis about what expedited means. That still means, several months instead of, over a year or what have you. But it's a good chance that you might see rulings in those cases perhaps earlier than some of the other federal cases that are going around right now, just because of that fact.
Yeah, I think that's right. You could still have the same basic complaint about the Second Circuit, right? They're supposed to be on this expedited schedule, but we haven't seen anything from them yet. But I do think that you're making a really good overall point here about the, court time. Court time is not the same as the time the rest of us run on, right? These cases can usually take years to process through the courts. And a lot of people, once they saw the Bruen ruling come down, and I think a lot of gun rights advocates saw that as a very favorable standard and took it as the courts, recommitting to focusing on this issue. And there's some people get this expectation that they're just going to take 5 or 6 Second Amendment cases a year. And that's not realistic in my mind, at least. First of all, already taken another Second Amendment case just a year after the last one. Now they have a lot to make up for, right? Because there's only been, I think it's 6 now, Supreme Court cases that deal directly with the Second Amendment. And only a couple of those have produced actual rulings that are significant precedent. Whereas you look at the First Amendment or the Fourth Amendment or the 14th Amendment or many of these other amendments to the Constitution have had so many more cases, hundreds and hundreds of cases for the court to, opine on the limits of the protections offered there or what have you. And so, they have a long way to go, but at the same time, I don't think that means they're going to just try to make all that ground up in a year. Right. Right.
No, that's a good point. And that also kind of ties in to we have a sort of a litany of questions, both from David and then a few other members about Weird Beard that they want to know, what are we thinking in terms of the Supreme Court? Are they going to take more cases? What are the odds that they're going to take the, Illinois assault weapon ban case after it's decided by the Seventh Circuit? Do we think the Supreme Court's waiting to combine a few Second Amendment cases at once to issue just one sweeping ruling? I don't know. What do you think? It's like you answered part of it there, I think, in your previous answer, but it's tough to say we're expecting the Supreme Court to make up, all this ground in a matter of a year or two, right?
Right, certainly. And they're not going to take any more Second Amendment cases for this session like that. They're done on the regular docket, at least, for the cases they're going to take up. There's some speculation that they could, take up Range, the nonviolent felon case out of Pennsylvania, and sort of combine that with Rahimi, which is the domestic violence restraining order case that they've already agreed to hear, and do sort of a low end, high end thing on, the limits of who can and can't be barred from owning guns under the Second Amendment. But maybe that'll happen. I don't think that's likely. What's more likely, because they're already through the period where they decided what cases they're going to take for the next session. And we're going to get a ruling in Rahimi. We'll get arguments this fall in Rahimi, and we'll get a ruling probably not until June of next year, because they usually wait until June to issue the most controversial ones. I don't know. It depends on whether the court thinks their ruling in that case is going to be controversial or not. Also, that's another tea leaf reading thing. They don't say that anywhere, right? The Supreme Court's not like, we're going to wait until it just so happens people notice that that's when they tend to issue the biggest cases. The ones that have 5-4 split or 6-3 split or whatever. And so, because most Supreme Court cases, by the way, if people didn't know, are unanimous. These guys agree on most of these cases most of the time. It's just the particularly politically charged ones that end up being, the courts being split. But regardless, the other option is that they could take something on what people call the shadow docket, which are these emergency requests. That's sort of when you mentioned earlier those emergency requests in the Second Circuit case and the Seventh Circuit case to intervene in by the court, or even just the recent ghost gun case where the government asked the court to intervene on an emergency basis. That's what people call the shadow docket, because often they'll make decisions like they did in the ghost gun case to issue a stay or take some sort of action without explaining why they did it, and it could have really significant implications down the line. But you don't get an actual hearing, you don't get oral arguments, you don't get a written opinion from the court. You just get an emergency decision. So there's still that avenue to work on this stuff. I think it would be quite odd if they chose to bolster their Second Amendment case law this way, by just issuing unexplained shadow docket decisions. But that's another way that they could go.
Yeah, I think especially on something like an assault weapon ban, which is obviously a hugely hot button. You talk about controversial
Yeah.
political stuff. And I highly doubt hardware bans, which is something that's obviously going to sort of be ripe and on the minds of a lot of Second Amendment lawyers and jurisprudence over the next few years, or however long it takes to get a final ruling. I highly doubt that they're going to issue that in some unsigned shadow docket opinion. So I wouldn't count on that. But where you might see something, one of our members asks, Weird Beard, by the way, great. Oh, actually, no, this was David. Sorry. He asked about the pistol brace rule.
David Rice he asked, what do you think? The pistol brace is, where's that case at right now, actually, first of all?
Yeah. So first of all, we had a series of injunctions issued by a district court, but he did not issue nationwide injunctions. In each of the cases, he limited the scope of those orders blocking the pistol brace rule to just the members of the individual gun rights groups that sued. And so that was then appealed to the Fifth Circuit, who took a look at the merits of the appeal, the merits of the injunctions, to a 3-judge panel of the Fifth Circuit. And they basically said that, in so many words, they think that this rule is likely not fit to stand and probably should be struck down, but they weren't going to overstep the bounds of the district court and issue that injunction themselves. So they basically spelled out for the lower court judge why they think that this rule is probably unlawful, and then they sent it back to him for him to issue a nationwide injunction, which basically just means please enjoin this so we don't have to. In which case, you could very well see a very
and by
similar...
the way,
oh, go ahead.
By the way, that's another common thing that you'll see in federal courts, where they issue a ruling, but the ruling itself technically is to remand the case back down to a lower court for them to issue the final injunction or whatever. And it's like, technically they haven't issued an injunction here, but they've told the lower court to issue an injunction, and it's kind of the same thing. That's how I look at it, at least in terms of reporting on this stuff.
Yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, it's very, you'll see this a lot with federal judges. They're usually sticklers for procedure, and they give deference to the due process of litigation. So they allow, the proper judge to make the final call, which it's quite common. But what you're going to see, I think, in this pistol brace case, if the district judge heeds the judgment of the Fifth Circuit, you'll probably see a very similar trajectory to what we just saw with the so-called ghost gun rule, where, of course, DOJ is probably going to appeal any injunction against their own rule, right? It's their job to defend their rule. And they'll probably, depending on the Fifth Circuit's already indicated at least that they don't seem keen on staying it. So you could very well see that end up on the Supreme Court shadow docket, where they could be in a position to make a similar decision to what they made with the ghost gun rule. Yeah.
Although I would actually expect the Fifth Circuit to kind of take a hint from what the Supreme Court just did with the ghost gun case, and they'll probably issue a stay until, until they get to the final merits decision in that case. So
that's a good point.
But I do still expect that they'll make it all the way up to the Supreme Court. The government's going to appeal that, just like they're going to appeal the ghost gun one. The government wanted the Supreme Court to take up the ghost gun case and skip over the Fifth Circuit altogether. The Supreme Court didn't do that, but that was the big ask from the government. And the fallback was to issue this stay, which the Supreme Court did. So I don't think there's any doubt that the government's going to try to take all of these cases, or maybe, it might not matter if they take up like the ghost gun case. It's going to be on the same basic grounds as the pistol brace case anyway. So that our decision in that case would be, would foretell whatever they were going to decide in the bump stock ban case or the pistol brace ban case too. So they might not just need to get one there, but I would expect they'd try to get all of them.
Yeah.
Next question, though.
Good points.
We have, we've got Adam Scavone. David Rice is a simpler name, but I shouldn't say anything, right? Stephen Gutowski. I don't think that's
right.
That's much harder over here than any of our members' names in there. But he's got a good question about the latest on the legal drama surrounding cannabis and firearms. There was actually a recent filing by the DOJ in a fairly interesting case, at least politically, out of Florida that was filed by Nikki Fried, who, she went in the primary against DeSantis. Anyway, she's the agricultural commissioner there, in Florida, for some strange old political reason, that's the office that controls concealed carry permitting in the state. I'm sure there was some sort of very interesting story behind why that got moved to that department at some point in Florida history. But regardless, she filed suit to try and invalidate the federal prohibition on marijuana users owning firearms, at least the ones that have a medical marijuana license or card or what have you. So in that case, DOJ just filed a brief that essentially said they disagree with the recent federal appeals court case that found this prohibition is unconstitutional generally. And obviously this has gotten some discussion surrounding Hunter Biden, his potential gun charge, which seems more likely than ever to happen because of his plea deal blowing up. But yeah, so there's some interesting stuff to talk about here with the latest on these cases. It sure seems like this prohibition is having a very hard time surviving the Bruen standard.
Yeah, I think it's probably a pretty safe bet that the federal court system is casting a very skeptical eye, especially under this new Bruen standard of, not just weed, but you're seeing all sorts of controlled substances cases kind of work their way through the lower federal courts. We've had a couple of district federal courts. One in Oklahoma was about weed, but another one that we've covered in Texas was about more than weed. There was some magic mushrooms involved. There was methamphetamine involved. So the whole controlled substances space doesn't seem to survive strict scrutiny because, historically, there were some prohibitions on using your guns while actively intoxicated, for example. A lot of times it was like you can't show up to your militia muster while being drunk. Right. So that's a pretty good analog for, you can't have a gun while you're high or something. But a lot of the courts are coming to the conclusion that there's really no historical federal law about if you've ever drank alcohol or something, you can't own a gun. And that's sort of where these cases are withering on the vine in the federal court system. So I think it's fair to say that the courts are casting a skeptical eye sort of as the political environment is also shifting towards greater acceptance of at least marijuana. We have 20 something states now that have legalized it recreationally, another 30 to 40 that have legalized it medically. And so I think it's a fascinating time for not just the legal cases, but to see them collide with the political realities. It's sort of an interesting time for this space.
Yeah, you also saw the same basic argument pop up in that Hawaii sensitive places case when they were.
That's right.
The judge was talking about carrying in restaurants that serve alcohol. This is sort of the same throughput. A lot of these cases, and that's kind of the nature of Bruen. Because a lot of these cases are going to rely on the same laws because there weren't that many regulations. Obviously, there were gun regulations, but a lot of them, they weren't as numerous as they are today, certainly. And so a lot of them are going to come up in a lot of these different circumstances. You also saw this, by the way, and I wrote a whole analysis piece on this for members. But this shows up in the government's case, their brief in Rahimi, in the domestic violence restraining order case, as a warning to the Supreme Court about how expansive the effects could be if they go with the Fifth Circuit's reasoning, if they go with the Fifth Circuit's interpretation of Bruen in the Rahimi case, because it's already led to, for instance, drug users, at least marijuana users, being kept from or being allowed to keep their firearms, striking down this law. So I'm getting a little bit put together on it, but that came up in that scenario as well.
Right. Yeah. And it's sort of goes to another analysis piece. And we've talked about this several times in the past about just broadly setting the parameters of who is covered under the Second Amendment, particularly in the context of this new test. Because we now kind of have the what's covered. We don't have it fully fleshed out, but we at least have, you can't ban handguns. It's this common instrument of self-defense. And Heller said, you can't ban those. Same thing with carry. We said, we established where you can carry in public. And we just don't really have a great idea of who just yet. And obviously Rahimi will, depending on how narrowly or broadly they decide to rule, will at least whittle away a little bit and give us a better idea of who can be prohibited from owning guns. And that should give us a little bit more indication of some of these marijuana cases that our member brings up here.
Yeah, I think that'll give us the beginning of the who. I mean, I still think we're kind of at the beginning of all the who, what, and where questions.
Yeah.
They're still going to need to flush out all of that stuff under Bruen. And so I would, we talked about how they're not likely to take 5 Supreme Court Second Amendment cases each year or whatever, but I do think they're going to have to take Second Amendment cases more frequently than they have in the past, just to flush out all these questions.
Yeah, I think that's right. All right. So we'll go to the next question here from Stephen Shepard. And he asks actually a pretty interesting question about sort of the lasting effects of that rise in gun ownership that we talked about over the pandemic years. And he wants to know.
Actually, I want to do this Thomas Schrader question first, because I think it ties into what Steven's asked.
Oh, yeah. About. I missed his question. Yeah, you're right. Okay. Good call.
It's a long podcast, and we already had some technical problems. We had to do it. So
that's right. Yeah.
Hopefully it doesn't show up on the final. Hopefully that'll be a mystery to you guys watching at home. But yes, Thomas Schrader asked, my question to you is, what story do you think that's been underreported that may end up changing things for the Second Amendment movement for better or worse? So I think that the answer to this, at least I have 2, and I'm interested in your thoughts as well, but I think that'll roll into Stephen's question too. But why don't you, what are your 2, first of all, for better or worse?
Yeah. So for better, I think we were kind of on the same page about there's just not a lot of follow-up done on that rise of gun ownership that I was kind of alluding to with the previous question. Yeah. We obviously covered it extensively as it was happening. It was showing up in the data that look at all these new gun owners, several million new gun owners. And you've seen a smattering of stories here and there, usually in local news, about look at this new, gun training is getting more diverse and that sort of thing. But there really hasn't been a ton of reporting on maybe the political dynamics that might bring about, which has the potential. We've talked about this pretty extensively over the last few years, has the potential to shift the politics of gun rights, because, when you have more people owning guns, you see it reflected in polling data. If you own guns, you're more likely to support, or at least more likely to oppose, stricter access to guns or overly strict gun laws. And so there hasn't been a ton of at least evidence or digging into whether or not that's shifted the needle one way or another. I know that's something you thought about as well.
Yeah, I think that's one of the biggest undercovered. Like, it's something that has gotten some coverage, and we've certainly written a lot about it. And we even had a piece this week on youth shooting sports and how they're growing at this moment. And I just think that from a macro perspective of media, that's not gotten a lot of coverage. It's gotten some, but for the potential effect that it could have in the long term, it hasn't gotten nearly enough attention, in my opinion. And probably hasn't gotten enough attention inside even just the gun owning community or the gun industry itself. This isn't to say that it's gotten no attention. It has there's been groups that have come up. There have been efforts by the industry and by gun rights advocates to try to connect with these new gun owners and look, this is not a trend that started into 2020. It's more of a trend that accelerated in 2020. But I think that that's the one major story that, even with the coverage it has received, is still undercovered. It's still underappreciated for the potential impact it could have. And what's your story on the other end? Something that doesn't get enough coverage that could have a negative impact on the gun rights movement, at least.
Yeah. So it's It's sort of, I think it's sort of related to your negative coverage thing that we kind of talked about this before we started recording, but there's sort of been an underappreciation, I think is a better word for it, of we're still seeing kind of a slip in gun sales. So despite this boom of new gun owners that we saw, maybe they'd be future, collectors or spree buyers, we're actually seeing year over year so far this year, multiple months where gun sales are way down. And it's funny that that's happening in a political environment where we have probably the most openly gun control president in maybe ever, but at least for the last few generations,
at
right?
least since the 90s. Yeah. At least since Clinton.
Yeah. And it's also, we're coming up on a presidential election when usually things start to wrap up when, you don't know when things are sort of in the air politically, you don't know who's going to take power. You tend to see gun sales spike in those occasions. And we're not really seeing that right now. And it'd be interesting to know kind of what's behind that. And I think that's sort of underappreciated, that maybe, are we seeing waning influence in gun ownership? There's just, I think, underexplored what's behind that.
Yeah. And I think that plays into Stephen's question here. He said, I understood that the net gun owners and ownership increased during the pandemic. Any evidence that these new gun owners are still engaged, training, shooting, other aspects of firearms ownership, reloading, competing, collecting, or was it just a fad is his question. And I think that goes into what you're talking about there with, we think that these new gun owners represent this potential sea change in gun culture and gun politics, but how has that actually played out to this point? Are we still seeing that? And I think that your point there about gun sales declining speaks to, I guess, at least some evidence against this idea, because, certainly you had record sales in 2020 and you had, the second best sales in 2021 and then third best in 2022. But now but each step along, you're in decline. And in 2023, it's continued to decline, and somewhat dramatically. We've covered this back in June. The numbers were down 20% year over year. That means June's sales numbers. And look, June is not a great year or a great month for gun sales. Generally, they tend to decline in the summer. So June compared to April is always going to be worse, or compared to December. But when you compare June to June, you're getting more of an apples to apples comparison. And it was 20% decline year over year. So that's really bad.
Right.
If you're a member of the gun industry, or if you're looking for sustained momentum among new gun owners for, going out and adding to their collection or what have you. And that we saw that trend continue in July, where July was down 17% year over year from the previous July. And, it's not as though we've seen a huge sea change in polling during this time period. If anything, that's actually my underappreciated story in the negative direction. If you're a gun rights advocate, polling has been the macro trend of polling over the last really decade or more has been going in the wrong direction. If you oppose stricter gun laws, because it's been going in favor of stricter gun laws for quite a while, and that includes the sort of ebbs and flows that we talk about with surrounding mass shootings, right? Surrounding high-profile events, you tend to get a spike and then a decline back down towards normal levels. However, if you look over a long enough trend line, those lower levels will still be higher than the previous lows. And that's something I think people haven't dealt with a lot in the gun rights movement. And we also haven't seen necessarily a huge shift because of these new gun owners on that point.
Yeah.
And so you have seen, there've been some trends that we followed that move in the other direction, right? Assault weapons bans in particular. It's kind of one of the interesting things about the political dynamics you were talking about with the President Biden, right? He's pushing for assault weapons bans, which is really the first time you've seen that from presidents since Clinton, where they actually passed one. But At the same time, that trend, that polling for that particular policy has dropped. And it's dropped among younger people, which are part of this whole gun culture 2.0. Although, some people don't think that's the right term for it necessarily. But that's neither here nor there. That was another comment we got from I think it was from Stephen himself, who's like, does it really make sense to call these people gun culture 2.0 if they're defined by wanting self-defense or wanting to do competitive shooting or owning guns for defense from people and from the government or what have you, because that's really not a new idea in any sense, and maybe even just a reversion back to the 18th and 19th century views of firearms ownership. But regardless, and that's maybe a fair point, but regardless, you have seen that effect, but it hasn't been much broader than that, in my opinion. I don't know. What do you think?
I think it's a shrewd point, because it is that the assault weapon ban historically, if you looked at historical trends in polls, that was one of the main policies to spike in the aftermath of mass shootings. Right. But as you pointed out, we've seen a pretty sticky indication that it's around like 50%. We've seen some dip below majority support, multiple polls confirming this. At the same time that other policies, be it red flag laws or, I don't know, take your pick, any other gun control policy, have seen a spike at the same time. Yeah. So on the one hand, you have maybe perhaps a win for gun rights advocates, maybe an underappreciated win on the assault weapons ban polling. But at the same time, as you pointed out, which I think is shrewd, there's sort of an underappreciated worrying sign in the polls where you're seeing not great signs. We've covered polls where folks are now, for the first time in over a decade, saying it's more important to reduce, quote unquote, reduce gun violence, whatever that means to respondents, than it is to protect gun rights, for example. So the deprioritization of gun rights among the general public, maybe outside of the gun rights movement, I think is something that's not being fully appreciated because there's such a sugar high from the Bruen decision, and because court cases are going so well for the gun rights movement at the moment. Sometimes some of that stuff can kind of get lost in the conversation, that the polling trends are perhaps slightly worrying.
I think that's exactly right. I mean, if you're a gun control advocate, they're moving in the right direction. And I'm talking here mainly about, the macro trends, like the vibe check stuff. Like, do you want stricter gun laws? Do you prefer guns restrictions to preserving gun rights? Those sorts of polling questions that don't ask about a specific policy necessarily, but about how Americans feel about guns at a given point in time. Those are all trending towards stricter gun laws, and that's something I don't think has gotten enough attention in at least in the gun rights movement. People tend not to focus much on that. It gets a lot of attention, I will say, in major media, obviously. There's a lot of focus there. So maybe it's not undercovered, and that's in the sense that there's a lot of media coverage of those basic numbers. And then in media, sort of the opposite happens with the assault weapons ban numbers, right? Yeah. I feel like those get a lot of attention in the gun rights community and not much attention in major media. So either way, you want to make sure that you have a full view of what's going on if you with any issue, but in particular in this scenario with how people are reacting to these polls, and not just rely on, the ones that make you feel good or the ones that make you feel bad. You got to try and take them all in.
That's a good point.
But Stephen also has another question here about common use. How does the community establish new common use? Let's say a new action is developed or an obscure one. For instance, he notes the Smith & Wesson rotating barrel for 5.7 by 28 is brought back. It's not in common use. And so is it now vulnerable to a ban? What happens when laser guns come out, or perhaps more realistically, you have rail guns now that are new, or even smart guns, right? The BioFire gun, we had the founder on the podcast a while back. That's a completely new technology in terms of firearms. It's fire by wire. It's not a mechanical trigger system. And clearly not in common use yet, depending on how you look at the question.
Right.
And so I think that's an interesting thing. Stephen notes the Bruen standard seems muddy about future arms development, and I think that's true, and one of the ironies, I guess, about this. But this standard, I guess we should just start with where it comes from, right? Where does the common use concept come from? And that comes from Miller, which is the 1934 decision that upheld the ban on or the inclusion of short barrel rifles in the National Firearms Act, because that was the basis for Heller. Now, this Miller is a very short opinion. There's a lot of interesting history around it and controversy over it, but it really is the parts that actually matter are fairly short, so people should actually read it. Frankly, I think there was a New York Times piece where they tried to sum up what was in Miller and got it completely wrong. And it's like, guys, there's only a couple paragraphs you need to read in that ruling. It's not like, please just read it if you're going to write about it. But Miller essentially talks about the essential conclusion is that only arms that are useful in militia service are protected by the Second Amendment. That's basically what Miller holds. However, it also holds that essentially the militia was made up of everyone. All able-bodied men were expected to perform militia service at the time and of the founding, and that they were expected to show up with their own firearms. And so essentially what the Second Amendment protected were guns that were in common use at the time, because those are the kinds of guns that people would be expected to show up to muster with. And so that's where you get the sort of dangerous and unusual concept, and that's where common use comes from. So basically just Second Amendment protects the guns that people had that they would show up to muster for militia service with. And so applying that to, it's sort of a backward looking standard, obviously,
right,
in that something that is in common use is protected, but only once it's become common. And so in theory, I guess you could probably ban newer technologies usually the Supreme Court also has the other aspect of this test, right? It's not just in common use, but also are they unusual and dangerous? So basically, is the gun that you're trying to ban outside of what most people own and also more dangerous than those firearms? That seems to be the kind of gist of what they're trying to get at with it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah. And I remember, I think, picks up on probably the chief. Obviously, gun control advocates might have their other critiques of the standard, but this is sort of like the main criticism of the in common use standard is sometimes things are outside of your control for what counts as common. I think your smart gun example is pretty shrewd, because I don't think anyone would expect that to be banned on any, political grounds. People on the right and left probably wouldn't have any mean grounds politically to say we need to ban that. But technically, under an in common use standard, it's not exactly common. People don't commonly own them for self-defense. And then there's also things like historical
I think it'd
policies.
still be hard. Sorry, go ahead, finish that.
I was just saying, there's also things like the NFA, for example, that kind of arbitrarily limited the expansion of certain weapons. And so it never allowed them to be common in the first place. They're fairly widely owned, depending on your definition of what common is.
Yeah,
but
that all comes down to like, what do you mean by common? I guess would be another question, because the Supreme Court found that stun guns were protected by the Second Amendment. The actual holding didn't get into the common use argument. It got into correcting Massachusetts Supreme Court about whether the standard is in common use at the time of the founding, which would only protect muskets and cannons and such things, but and said that's obviously not true. It didn't get into it's sort of the implication is perhaps that there are enough stun guns that they would be in common use for self-defense or for lawful purposes. And Alito mentions in his concurrence that there's only a couple 100,000 of them out there, and he thinks that means common use, but we haven't really gotten like the court to give a number because a couple 100,000, well, that would include things that are in the NFA. There's millions
Sure.
of legally owned silencers and sound suppressors that are registered in the NFA. So, yeah, I mean, it is a murky thing. It's not a perfect standard, and it hasn't been fully flushed out, just like we mentioned earlier, right? Like, they've got a lot of flushing out to do with a lot of this stuff.
Yeah. And you're starting to see, it's funny, you're starting to see, I don't know if you want to call them gun control, but at least the gun control side is using the common use standard to their advantage by kind of whittling down the standard we've covered in hardware ban cases where they uphold hardware bans, where they say it only protects guns that are in common use for self-defense only.
Yeah.
And not only do they have to be for self-defense, but they have to actually be documented and used in self-defense incidents for them to count.
Right.
So
and
you
also
have to pull up.
Not just used, but this has come up a number of times in the magazine restriction cases, where they argue that it's not just that you're using a 15-round magazine or 17-round magazine or whatever that might be in your gun. You actually have to shoot 17 rounds
Right,
in engagement.
right.
It has to be documented in like a news story or something, which is just not
Right.
A very common thing to happen in terms of whether that's how they've been deciding it, at least. And yeah, you're right. And I think that obviously gun rights advocates view that as a perversion of the standard, because it doesn't say in common use for only self-defense. It says in common use for lawful purposes. And I mean, they've used it in different contexts a number of times, but the idea wasn't that you have to actually, when the Supreme Court decided Heller, they didn't go through and list out all the statistics on how often guns are used in handguns are used in self-defense. They just said, this is what people say they essentially want these guns for. And so it wasn't based on like looking at databases of defensive gun use for to prove whether something's in common use for self-defense.
Right. But to our members' point, that obviously there are a lot of questions still to be fleshed out in the common use standard. And perhaps that'll be one of the things that the Supreme Court eventually does, because as we pointed out, judges are kind of coming to just decisions all over the place about how to do common use, what counts as common, how specific do we get. So it's a good question.
Yeah. And I think that we got just two more questions, and I think they're somewhat related. So I'm going to kind of smush them together here to finish this out, because they're less about, legal standards and polling and stuff like that, and more about, trying to reach people in terms of where they are, I guess, as using arguments that are maybe outside of your typical Second Amendment arguments. If the gun rights movement wants to expand its footing. And so the first one comes from William, and he says, he asks, or he says first, in the long term, I simply don't see an alternative to growing the tent and building a popular majority coalition spanning different political ideologies if those of us in blue states want to maintain any victories that the courts might grant us in the near future. And so he asks, are there any figures in the mainstream Second Amendment community who are committed to growing the ranks of gun owners in majority liberal states, meeting people where they are on political issues that are irrelevant to the Second Amendment, and or identifying pro-Second Amendment people who can appeal to liberal voters? So I think that's a good question, right? Like what's going on in terms of places that are never going to have, a gun rights supermajority in their legislatures, right?
Sure.
Blue states, like, what's being done there? Are there any groups working towards trying to, make some inroads among perhaps Democratic voters or politicians on this issue? And the answer is yes. There are a number of groups. The first one that comes to mind for me is the Liberal Gun Club. In terms of this particular description, they have chapters all over the country. I've spoken to a couple of them. And they try to do that exactly what William is asking about, which is appeal to voters and politicians who are supportive of gun rights, but are generally liberal on other issues, because they don't necessarily see those things as being in conflict. I think their motto is all civil rights for all people, and so they view gun rights as a civil right. They're still a fairly small organization, right? And but they do exist, and they are certainly one of the more fascinating gun rights groups out there. You also have, of course, groups that are dedicated to particular demographics, like the National African American Gun Association or a Girl in a Gun Shooting League. There's a number of female-focused. The DC Project would be another one. Now, I don't know that those are, they're not necessarily, like the Liberal Gun Club is about trying to get liberals who own guns to activate and be politically involved, and also give them just a space to gather together and shoot. But some of these other groups they're not that they're liberal groups or anything. They're single issue focused groups, but they look at specific demographics that haven't gotten the same level of attention from the gun rights community, the gun rights movement as an organized thing. And so these groups have popped up to try and satisfy that demand for these alternative groups. There's Asian American gun rights groups now, and there's also you'll see individual content creators or what have you, political accounts like A Better Way 2A, I think, is one that sort of I don't know if they're what you would label them politically, but they're not your typical conservative Republican, right? You get a lot of conservative Republicans in the space.
There's also like the Socialist Rifle Association and like the John Brown Gun Club. And there's all sorts of, it's interesting, small, like you said, they're usually smaller groups, but they're popping up all over the place lately, trying to appeal to different spaces in the political spectrum that are typically associated with gun rights.
Right.
You
Yeah.
also see
go ahead.
I would say there's also, it's not necessarily activating them politically, but you see people like Professor David Yamani, for example, who is a college professor that as part of his course takes college students to a gun range. That's part of his class, and it at least gets them exposed to firearms and lets them shoot and has them write about it and talk about how maybe it changed their mind or opened their mind, or if it didn't, explain why. So that's not maybe exactly what our members getting at, but that's another example of just you don't usually think of college towns as bastions of gun rights, right? So just getting college students exposed to shooting in a safe environment is a small step that a lot of people are taking.
Yeah, so there's a lot of groups out there, and especially ones that have either come up or grown significantly over the past couple of years with as part of the effects of those new gun owners that we've been talking about. This could be sort of a sign of some of the impact that they've had. But and look, you don't need necessarily all 8 million new gun owners that were created in those pandemic years to turn into gun voters, single issue voters, or activists. But if you have some percentage of them do that, they presumably will have a significant impact down the line. We're just still, I think, waiting to see really big signs of that. But, for instance, Moms Demand Action had their conference just a week or so back. And, they gathered a bunch of their committed activists in Chicago. The vice president spoke there. The governor of the state signed a new gun control bill while he was there. That was, and they had about 2,000 activists show up to that. So, according to their Instagram posts on it. And so that gives you an idea of you don't need 100,000 new activists. You can still have a pretty significant impact with the right strategy. And I mean, Moms Demand Action's case, they have a lot of funding, obviously, from Michael Bloomberg and elsewhere that helps. But the point is that you can still have that significant impact with just a couple thousand people who are really dedicated to whatever cause you're promoting. And so that, you look at the increase in membership for both the Liberal Gun Club or perhaps even more so the National African American Gun Association. They've really grown the last couple of years, and how that all is going to play out. They're still just getting started in trying to be politically influential in a way that makes their members happy. And so I think it'll be a while before we see the full fruits of that, but there are some signs. I think I was pretty pessimistic about it earlier, but I still do believe that that's having an effect and will have an effect going forward. And then we had Paul Ansel was the last member who sent in a question, and I thought this kind of goes in line with the previous one. Today, I feel that a strong argument against gun control can be made without depending on the Second Amendment, depending instead on rational evaluation of the current situation, i.e. a lot of guns and the potential impact of proposed legislation, i.e. very annoying but not significantly impacting the number of guns available to criminals. And, he's saying that perhaps that would be more persuasive than some of the typical arguments you hear from gun rights advocates, especially when I think trying to appeal to that group that William was asking about, these sort of non-traditional gun owners or people on the fence about owning guns. I think there was a Pew poll that just came out. We might have to write a piece about this next week, but they found that 2/3 of Americans either own guns or are open to owning guns. And so, there's a lot of people who are persuadable on this point, it seems. And I do think Paul is onto something there with this basic argument. And this is something that I think about a lot, actually, because, you see a lot of, especially on the gun control side, mocking of certain ideas, especially around like protecting schools from shootings, right? There was the whole hardened schools, the single point of access thing. And you see a lot of mockery around that idea because it doesn't sound like, even if it has some effect, some positive effect, that it's not going to stop. It doesn't get at the core issue of, somebody trying to shoot up their school, right? You see that brought up a lot as sort of a mocking comment on gun rights advocates' point of view on this situation. But when you start to think about, a lot of the proposals that you hear the other way, they're just as unrealistic, if honestly more so, because at least the hardening a school might have some impact. But the idea that, for instance, magazine limits, right? The concept behind a lot of these, at least the political argument that you'll hear, is basically that in mass shootings, if the person has to reload more frequently, that gives potential victims like a moment to try and tackle them. And look, that can happen in a mass shooting, but it's not a super realistic plan for stopping one. And also there are, hundreds of, I would even put it maybe into the billions of magazines that you'd have to go around and collect to get to the point where a magazine limit would matter. I mean, you live in a state that has a magazine limit, right? Like how hard is it for anyone who wants a magazine that holds more than, 15 rounds in Colorado?
Yeah, it's 15 in Colorado.
To get one.
Yeah, they're pretty ubiquitous. Yeah, they're pretty ubiquitous.
So,
it just speaks to all, not just magazines, but most hardware bans. Even if you manage to completely cut off the supply, even if there weren't workarounds or whatever, there's still, to his point, something like 400 million guns already in circulation. At least tens of millions of those are what would be classified as so-called assault weapons. And as to your point, magazines, hundreds of millions, if not billions. So it's like, you're kind of, you're not really going to put a dent.
People don't even get the context. They think, oh, that's a lot of guns. I know that, that's a big number. It's a lot of guns. Well, yeah, and the estimate is there's 25 million AR-15s and AK-47s and similar firearms. That's the National Shooting Sports Foundation estimates that, the industry group. And that same number, the 400 million, comes from the Small Arms Survey, which is that's their estimate for total civilian guns. Well, the total number of law enforcement firearms in that same estimate for the United States is about 1 million. So you'd have to figure out a way to confiscate 25 times the size of the entire law enforcement apparatus in the United States armory in order to get all those guns actually off the streets. And like, these are not, it's just, when you think about the numbers, they don't sound very, these plans don't start to seem very realistic, right?
Yeah.
But it's hard to get people to think that way. They think, well, if the person didn't have a gun when they couldn't get a gun when they went to try and, shoot up the mall or whatever, then they couldn't have carried out the attack. Now, obviously, there are other ways of carrying out mass attacks, and they do happen, but guns are the most frequent. And so people it's a fairly straightforward, logical argument of, well, you just didn't have guns or didn't have that gun or whatever, maybe this wouldn't have happened. And they don't go further beyond that to think about the practical questions of how you would even try. Let's say 90% of people wanted to give up their ARs. So you found that's never going to happen based on the history of gun confiscation, different efforts to confiscate certain guns or magazines in the United States, because they have atrocious compliance rates. But maybe they, something changes and everybody wants to get their guns and you got 90% off. You'd still have 2.5 times as many ARs out there as the law enforcement community has all guns. That's for every law enforcement agency in the entire country, from local to state to federal. So it's just not these are often not very practical ideas that get put forward. And I think that is an important thing to point out, because it's also something that doesn't get talked about a lot, right?
Right.
Mostly you just get constitutional arguments, that violates the Second Amendment, or just that people wouldn't comply. But even if most people did want to comply, you'd still end up in a situation where most of these guns you just have an almost unfathomable amount of firearms that you'd still have to deal with. And so I think it's a strong argument. It does have that downside of that's not how a lot of people think about these issues. But
Right.
I think we did a pretty good job of getting through everyone's questions. And so, yeah, what do you think, Jake?
Yeah, no technical difficulties aside, like you said, hopefully that comes across seamless in the final product. But yeah,
Yes.
Once again, happy to answer questions. I appreciate all the members submitting their thoughtful questions. We always love hearing what's on their minds, and grateful that they're participating in the reload with us.
And I think these were really good questions again.
Yeah.
And so I'm always happy to do these, whenever we can, especially if there's like a little bit of a slow week, we can hopefully just get people to send in what they're thinking about. And it also helps us for future stories. Like, here's what everyone's thinking about, so let's try and keep on top of those things. So it's super helpful for us. But if you want to participate in the next question and answer podcast, if you'd like to ask one of the questions, or if you want to appear on the show, we had a couple of people say they'd like to be on the show, and hopefully we can get that scheduled for the next couple episodes here, because those are some of my favorite segments, the member segments. But if you want to do that, you got to be a member, right? So head on over to thereload.com and check out our membership options today. And yeah, that's all we've got for this week. We will see you guys again real soon.